All right, so we are going to look at part two of our conversation about Washington and Adams, Federalist, Anti-Federalist, Federalist, Democratic, Republicans, um, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, these important early founders of American institutions. So, just as a reminder, where do we leave off in this election of 1796? We see the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans, Adams versus Jefferson. Adams is going to win. Jefferson, coming in second by a pretty slim margin, will become his vice president. Right off the bat, Adams is going to be a pretty controversial president. And he's kind of like I mentioned before with George Washington, where we think of him as this myth of who he was instead of what his presidency was actually like. In AP US history, we are going to learn a lot about the battles between Adams and Jefferson, and know that the election of 1796 and then 1800 are really ugly in terms of their vitriol, the names that they were calling one another, which we will learn more about in the folders in this unit. But it was a very ugly election. We sort of think that nowadays we have the market cornered on what one candidate will say or do to or about another candidate. Not so. These elections were very nasty. Accusations of illegitimate children, accusations of not being religious, which of course at the time was a big deal. Are you an atheist? Do you have a mistress? Did you marry your wife illegally? All kinds of stuff was being thrown around. And of course, Jefferson and Adams were definitely political enemies, although in their later years, they still had a rivalry, but came to absolutely understand one another a little bit better. And I really love that, to be honest with you. But Adams is a big believer, obviously, in liberty. We think of John Adams. I loved that series that was on, I think it was HBO, maybe it was Showtime, about John Adams. He's such a fascinating character, and he had such a love of these ideas, these Enlightenment ideas of liberty and justice. And there were times during his administration where the practicalities of his job sometimes found him at odds with his policies. Some believed were at odds with those ideals. So we're going to jump right in to some controversies related to John Adams by talking about the XYZ affair. Essentially, the United States is trying to negotiate with the French, in particular a diplomat named Talleyrand, and Talleyrand wants to be paid by this American delegation to engage in negotiations, and they outline it in a memo, and XYZ sort of become the placeholders for the actual names of the individuals involved. The Americans are horrified. Talleyrand regularly expected diplomats to pay him for the privilege of a negotiation. But the French were actively seizing American ships, and America was having none of it. They go to France. They try to negotiate. Then the French want to be paid for the privilege of the negotiation, and the United States is furious. They release the memo, the letter that was written by the French diplomats. France is mad because France looks at the Jay Treaty and says, why do you have a special relationship with Britain? What about us? Aren't we important too? And so it's a really big deal. It's important because it's really going to lead to something called a quasi-war with France, 1797 through 1798, where there's no formal declared war, but John Adams is going to start building boats. We're going to have a navy under John Adams, and that navy is going to attack French ships in the Atlantic who are actively, again, engaged in the seizure of American ships. So public opinion is really turning against France, and because the Democratic Republicans, including Vice President Thomas Jefferson, because they're not speaking up against France, they start losing popularity. And this incident might have killed the Democratic Republican Party, but John Adams could not get out of his own way. And he turns right around in response to this and institutes something called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which are widely regarded to be some of the worst examples of American idealism codified into law in the history of the United States. It gave the government the ability to throw into jail any foreign citizens that they thought could be a threat. They could kick out foreign citizens or foreign residents if they were considered to be dangerous. The residency requirement to become a citizen was increased. So it's harder to become a citizen if you are a foreigner under these acts. And you are not allowed to criticize the government. In fact, you can go to jail. On the right here, there is a drawing that features a Federalist named Roger Griswold and a Democratic Republican named Matthew Lyon. And they actually get into a fist fight in Congress. And Matthew Lyon is sent to jail. Remember, he's a Democratic Republican. John Adams is a Federalist. And the Federalists believe that the Democratic Republicans are a threat to national security, to the existence of the country. And John Adams really believes that the Democratic Republicans cannot be allowed to gain prominence in politics. And so these Alien and Sedition Acts also target Democratic Republicans. But the thing is that the public, the American public, says, hang on, maybe we should not be using the power of the federal government to target our political enemies. And that is absolutely the perception of what John Adams is doing as part of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So the reaction by the Democratic Republicans are the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, where essentially both of those states come out and say, we think that the Alien and Sedition Acts are unconstitutional. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are co-writers of those. There's also going to be introduced for the first time this theory of nullification. If a state thinks that a federal law is unconstitutional, can the state nullify it? Meaning, can we as states just not follow federal laws? And that will be something that will come into play in the Civil War. Oh my gosh, that says Revolution of 1800. So what are we talking about here? It's an election of 1800, but in a lot of ways, it is a revolution because we go from Federalists being in charge to anti-Federalists or Democratic Republicans, or in this case, they're calling them just Republicans, being in charge. It is a fairly slim margin, but it's still more substantial than in the last election. The Federalists are going to split the vote in three ways. You have Adams, Pinckney, and Jay. Poor John Jay down there with one electoral vote. People weren't really happy with his treaty. And then you have Jefferson and Burr. So as it says down here in the little footnote, it says that Jefferson was chosen as president by the House of Representatives. Aaron Burr, who also got 73 electoral votes, was chosen as vice president by the House of Representatives. That's huge. Aaron Burr was almost our president. I mean, it's crazy enough that he was our vice president, but he was almost our president. And as it says also, just like the last one, in elections before 1804, each elector voted for two candidates. So first place is going to be president, and second place is going to be vice president. So right now, the Democratic Republicans, who were almost down and out for the count with the XYZ affair and the Quasi-War, make a comeback with the Alien and Sedition Acts being so unpopular. And so we have the Revolution of 1800. What does American society look like during these early years? Most families were producing goods and for personal consumption. So think about subsistence farming and small sort of cottage industries. But in this new nation, families are starting to think about new marketplaces, going to work in urban areas, that type of thing. We see the emergence of a new class of entrepreneurs and investors, and a clear split between manufacturers, led by the likes of Alexander Hamilton, and farmers, led by the likes of Thomas Jefferson. In terms of Native Americans, there are going to continue to be treaties with them as the Native Americans lose more and more land. There is also the Indian Trade and Intercourse Acts, which which is designed to protect against illegal land seizures and abuses, but also institutes civilization programs where children are taken from their homes, taught to dress in only Western style clothing, speak only English, and learn Christianity. Women have very limited political and property rights. They do, in this new country, have more rights in their marriage, like being able to ask for a divorce. But there is this concept of Republican motherhood that is really going to haunt American women, at least I would argue, for a long time. This idea that it is a woman's job to raise virtuous citizens. And I think that that idea is still around. People who say that the women's place is in the home, that it's their job to raise the kids, that the women, are the softer ones, the only ones capable of teaching their children how to be good citizens and what the right morals and values are. Of course, we know fathers are equally capable of doing that, just as women are equally capable of participating in politics and the workforce. But Republican motherhood is going to be used to keep, I would say, women in the home. But it also allows for more educational opportunities for women, because women should be, the argument is, educated in American values and understand Enlightenment ideas. After all, we are the ones passing those ideas on to the next generation. I love this document, these documents here, Blacks and Slaves in the New Republic. There's an excerpt on the left, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence of 1776, where he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." There's a man named Benjamin Banneker, his name is down there. He is an African-American man in the United States, and he writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson in 1791, where he says, in reference to Thomas Jefferson's writings in the Declaration of Independence, he says, "Sir, how pitiable it is to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind and of his equal and impartial distribution of these rights and privileges, which he hath conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others, with respect to yourselves." I find that to be incredibly powerful, and also a really important reminder that even during this time period, this controversy of slavery is very much a real controversy, and people are very much aware of the contradictions found in the Declaration of Independence and the institution of slavery in the United States. That those, how can you sort of walk and chew gum at the same time there? How can you hold those two ideas at the same time? And of course, it's not sustainable to hold those two ideas at the same time. But it is something that people are being called out on. So let me know if you have any questions about any of this. I think this is a good spot for us to wrap up this conversation. We'll be talking more about all of these ideas soon. Let me go back to Aaron Burr real quick, because I don't think I mentioned. You guys know about Aaron Burr as vice president, right? The guy in the right there on the map. Aaron Burr is going to be an incredibly controversial American historical figure. Of course, he's going to be responsible for killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel. You weren't really supposed to hit anyone in duels. You were just supposed to fire to the side. And Aaron Burr says he fired to the side, but it didn't work, and nobody believed him. He was kind of disgraced. He also presides over a plot to essentially have New York secede from the Union. It's just bizarre behavior from anyone, but certainly from the Vice President of the United States. So lots of contradictions and craziness going on during these early political years. This is also the percentage of free blacks related to the total population as of 1800. There are 5.3 million people living in the United States. 1 million of those are Black. And again, it just goes state by state, and it shows you what percentage of free Blacks relative to the total population of Blacks in that state. So Massachusetts in 1800, 100% of the Blacks in Massachusetts are freed. But then you go down to Tennessee, 2%, Kentucky, 2%. Maryland, even 16%. So it really varies across the United States. And I think that these are interesting statistics to look at as we sort of turn the corner into 1800 and look forward in 61 years to the Civil War. Let me know if you guys have any questions about this part 2.